Good morning, everyone. Happy New Year to each of you. I hope you all had a wonderful Christmas with your family. I'm really excited to kickstart the new year. We have Michelle here and some great content to cover, and I'm glad to see each of you and have you join us. Just a few housekeeping things. I noticed a lot of you have already muted. If you haven't muted your computer, if you would kindly do that, so we just have no background noise when Michelle's presenting. 10 o'clock on the dot, so I always like to start on time. I know your time is very valuable, so we're going to go ahead and kickstart this. Welcome, Michelle. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year.
So we have a lot of content to cover, and with questions and all, I want to just make sure we have enough time to cover everything. So let's go ahead and jump in. Our first topic we're going to cover is FFCRA extension and what that means to the employer and the employees. Can you talk a little bit about that for us?
Sure. The FFCRA is the Families First Corona Response Act that was effective from April 1st through December 31st of last year. While we did expect to see some form of federal leave required, so far in 2021 we have not. But what we do have is an extension that's optional for employers. So by that I mean, just a little bit of a recap, the FFCRA was made up of two parts. The emergency paid sick leave, which provided up to 80 hours for different reasons that people missed work. So not if they were working remotely, but if they missed work due to a COVID-related reason on the poster, then they were eligible for, or they were required to be paid if you were mandated under this act, and as most employers were under 500 employees. Well, that was a requirement through December 31st. There was also an expanded FMLA portion because initially during this pandemic, we had schools and childcare closed. So this was an effort to support working parents as well. So that ended on December 31st as a requirement for employers. But what has been extended through March 31st of 2021 is an optional provision that allows employers, if they choose, to continue to follow the pay requirements of FFCRA, they're able to get the tax credits. So it's a business decision that each employer needs to make. There's pros and cons, I'll go over that. But the tax credit, initially when this law came out, I had employers calling me panicking, I'm gonna have to shut the doors. And then they realized that they got a dollar for dollar tax credit, which did mean you had to have some paperwork, administration work on your end to be able to safely claim those credits. So you would, have a form, have some documentation for, the child's school or place of childcare that was closed, or if they missed work because they were told to quarantine by a healthcare provider, the name, the documentation that supported that advice from a healthcare provider, that was a reason on the poster. So essentially, the ability for an employer to get a tax credit through March 31st is what was extended. So what employers need to do at this point is make a business decision. What are the pros and the cons? Well, some people think that this is a no-brainer to extend to the employees because they're not losing much money. There's just a little bit of time. So when you can offer a benefit to an employee at little to no cost to your company, then why wouldn't you do it? So that's where, again, the tax credits and the documentation comes in. You should maintain your files so that you would be able to satisfy like an IRS audit. That's how your documentation should be set up for each tax credit that you take. And you can take it in advance. Initially, there was some cash flow, might have been the con for employers to take that because they would pay the taxes and then wait on the IRS to give them a credit. Now, by using Form 7200, you can take the credit before you pay the taxes. So you're only paying a reduced amount. So that was a big pro as to the reason to do it. The other pro is that COVID is not going away. In fact, we've seen a spike in a lot of areas. So even though it's an impact to employers to have employees missing, something like this allows it to not hit your bank as much of your bank time or your pay, and allows for employees to be able to stay home when they're sick or feel more comfortable staying home. They're not put in that position where they have to choose between getting paid or staying home. So that's another benefit or pro for doing it. The cons, like I mentioned, it can be an administrative burden to employers. Another thing is that if a company, especially a smaller employer, is partnering with a PEO to have benefits, you have to work with your PEO and find out, can you get the credit? How do you get the credit? And just the paperwork involved there. So it can be an administrative burden. The other con I'll say is that I had a lot of employers feeling like the employees were taking advantage of this. In fact, when it got down to the wire the last week of December, I had a lot of calls where people were saying, you know, they were putting in to take their FFCRA pay before it expired, and employers had to have those conversations that, you know, it's not just out there for you to use. It truly must be a COVID-related reason. Just to recap on that, if you were advised to quarantine by a healthcare provider, if you were ill, experiencing symptoms and seeking a diagnosis, if you had to care for a family member under one of those previously mentioned reasons, or child care. So it was either 100% pay or 2/3% pay, depending upon the reason that somebody missed. So that's a decision an employer needs to make now. And you need to decide and then communicate your decision to your staff. You don't have to post the poster anymore, which is, I think, what most employers objected to. Is it was posted to let people know their rights, but since it's no longer mandated and it's your option, it's not required to be posted. Also, some employers are saying, could I continue with the emergency paid sick leave part, but not the extended FMLA part, because that's more of a hardship to me? And so, yes, you can do that.
Michelle, can you speak on, and we've had a question come in, if an employer sends an employee home to quarantine and test for COVID-19, if their results are negative, is this covered under the FFCRA?
So really the best way to keep track of the reason somebody misses work and whether or not it's covered is to just look at the poster itself. This was a new law, new requirement from the DOL. And what they did was they put out a lot of FAQs that are great for these situational issues that come up. Well, in that example, in that question, it's focused on what the test result is. But if you go back and you look at the poster, the bullet point or the reason under the poster is if they are ill with COVID-related symptoms, which initially we were looking for a fever and loss of taste and smell, but that's really broadened to be cough, dizziness, severe fatigue, headaches. It's kind of run the gamut. So if somebody is ill with something that would fall under what deemed COVID-related symptoms, and they're seeking a diagnosis, so they go hand in hand. So seeking a diagnosis could be going to the doctor to find out what's wrong, could be taking a test. It doesn't say if it's positive or negative. So it doesn't really matter. If somebody is out sick, seeking a diagnosis, then it's covered. So the result is important for an employer to decide when somebody can come back to work and how much time they're going to be allowed to miss, and what pay was due, last year under that FFCRA requirement. So the result itself really is not as significant, but I've had employers ask me, can I require the test results to be turned in to me? Can I require the documentation? And you absolutely can. you can ask those questions. Did you test? What was your result? And that's because we're in a pandemic. The EEOC has come out and said that those are not considered medical related inquiries and they're permissible under ADA. So you're allowed to ask those questions and get that documentation because you have a business need to know at this point. You need to know, how should I pay them and when can they return, and who do I need to contact if they've been exposed to this person before we knew the results. So the results are good to get because you have to take other action, but the result alone is not what triggers whether or not FFCRA should be paid. And again, it's optional right now through the end of March. But I do want to add this, it's optional for an employer, but not to choose this employee or that employee. Right? You decide as a company what you're going to allow. And then once you allow it, you follow that designation consistently.
Thank you, Michelle. So I know the vaccine is a big hot topic right now. Can you visit with everyone about the pros and the cons of that, the do's and the don'ts? If you do, if you are operating a business, what that looks like?
Sure. So the vaccination is a very hot topic, and I know many of us are just tired of COVID, but it's not going anywhere, and we have some business decisions to make. And one of those decisions is what you're going to do as an employer regarding the vaccination. So it is an individualized assessment, which you hear a lot in the HR world. And all that means is you're looking at the specific details that might be unique to your organization, the way your employees work, the work itself, how close you are to each other, the population you serve, like if you're in a nursing home or, in the food industry, there are specific requirements, right? If you're in a nursing home, there's other requirements that the state places upon you for health and human services. If you're in the food industry, you have requirements under the Food and Drug Administration. So there are a lot of other requirements in addition to just, can I make this vaccine either required or can I recommend it? And that's really the decision that you need to make as an employer. So right now, not everybody can get it. It does depend on the type of work that you do. You're seeing hospitals, they're, frontline, they're getting it. I know a lot of physicians and nurses that have chosen it. I know many hospitals have mandated. Also know some big ones that are recommending it and not mandating it. And there's very good reasons why they choose one or the other. And again, it depends on the individual circumstances. So some of the pros of vaccinating is to reduce the risk of COVID in your workplace and to reduce the risk either to the population that you serve, which would be, an aging population if you're a nursing home or assisted living or healthcare field. If you're, in an office, maybe you don't have the same concern, the same exposure. So you need to make those decisions. One of the big cons is it's new and we don't yet know how it may affect us. We do know that it's 2 shots. We do know that, it's going to be rolled out on a tiered basis, depending upon who's deemed a priority. We also know that a lot of people have very personal, strong views on this vaccination. So one of the things that you have to decide as an employer when you're assessing your risk is, what am I going to do if my long-term, very valuable employee, has a very firm stance on this and is against getting it? So I'm not saying that you base your company decision on how one employee might feel, but you have to take that into consideration because it's other things that affect the workforce are morale issues and turnover of your team and what are you going to do if you have a mass exodus because you want to require it? You have to plan ahead for these sort of things and make that decision. A very big hospital in our area has decided not to mandate it, but to incentivize it. So, and I'll go into a little bit of when you mandate it, what does that mean? And when you recommend it, what does that mean? Well, this particular hospital is recommending it, but giving a bonus for people that get it. So that brings the choice still back to the individual employee. Now, whether or not you decide to mandate it or recommend it, there are a few things that you need to know on the employment side. If you decide to mandate it and somebody refuses, it's their choice and they're free to make that choice, but you are also free as an employer, it's a private employer, to make that a requirement of employment. So if they refuse, there are a few exceptions that you need to consider before you say it's a requirement, and if you don't want to do it, you can go work somewhere else that may not require it. The two things that you need to consider fall under Title VII. It's an employment law on a federal level, and ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, which is federal law. So both of those laws take into consideration religious freedoms, and if somebody has an underlying medical condition or disability that may prohibit them from safely getting the vaccination. So if either one of those things come up as somebody's reason why, it should not be an automatic, it's my decision. If you don't want to do it, there's the door, go work somewhere else. It should be a process of open communication back and forth with the employee. And of course, with anything HR related, documentation is going to be key. So you should have a process in place where you ask somebody, to make a written request for what it is they want and why. So in the case of a religious, under the Title VII, the religious protection, it's not just because I happen to believe vaccinations are bad. That alone is not going to trigger that Title VII protection. But what will is what we call a sincerely held religious belief. So you need to find out what that belief is. And if it's sincerely held, an employee should have no problem explaining what they want and why it's against their religion. So having that process documented and having a regular go-to statement that an employer, whether it's a supervisor or HR person, makes, this is our process. I'm not singling you out because you may have a disability or you may be a different religion. I'm telling you, this is my consistent process that I want all employees to follow when they request something different than what I have, whether it's a different holiday than what you acknowledge in your company, or dress code, clean shaven or something else. That should be your go-to response, because what you're hoping to get from the employee is then a written reason in their own words why they want an exception for them. Then at that point, you vet what they've told you. And you can call us. We can't really go over every possible scenario and what your steps should be. But for both of those exceptions, there should be back and forth communication where you're not condemning the employee for requesting it. You're keeping an open mind. Your ultimate answer may be that we can't accommodate this exception in the role you're in. Let's say that the person was a nurse working on the front line with, an immune compromised population. In that case, and you've made the decision as the employer that you're going to require it, then maybe they can no longer work in that capacity, but maybe they could move to a different section of the facility and or a different job. So you can make those sort of accommodations, but it should be a step-by-step process that's well documented with open interactive communication. And if you need any more details on that, I invite you to call us and talk about your specific situation. But what I will say is we've seen a lot of OSHA activity where it relates to this pandemic. And Biden has said, I think I mentioned in the last Clear Up the Chaos, that this is going to be a focus of his in this administration. And he's committed to hiring more OSHA investigators. So I don't know if you're familiar with something like contact tracing, where we're trying to find out where the exposure occurred. So one of the reasons employers need to have a safe working environment as it relates to COVID is it does fall under the OSHA General Duty Clause, which says that you have a duty as an employer to keep employees safe from known hazards. Well, obviously, COVID is a known hazard in the workplace. So that's why we do things like social distance, limit congregating in common areas where a lot of people are going to be there, wear masks, allow people to work remotely where that's possible. Because if something does happen in the workplace and it can be traced back to the workplace, then it does fall under workman's comp. So that is a consideration under whether or not you should vaccinate, because if you can show that you've taken all necessary precautions to limit the exposure in your workplace, then that lessens that. If you have, one of the things that you should do, I'll back up a little bit, is if an employee comes to you and tests positive, they've had symptoms, could be the example earlier, but instead of negative, the test is positive, then the employer should say, who were you in close contact with, the 48 hours before you tested positive or before you had symptoms. And that is where you need to reach out to those employees or customers or people that you serve and inform them that there was a possible exposure and that they should monitor for symptoms and seek the advice of their medical professional. So let's say, and that's what you should do. So let's say you don't do that. Somebody is sick and you've got to get, the trucks out or the line moving, and you don't separate that person that might be contagious, and then everybody that works next to them ends up getting the same symptoms and becomes ill, then at that point you have a hard position under OSHA. It might be that you have been deemed as the place where they got this. So contact tracing is important. Contact tracing is something that you should do, and then be able to take those necessary precautions. So when you're responding to OSHA asking you, because it's going to be complaint driven, right? A complaint happens, an OSHA investigator gets involved and they try to reach out to you. Well, we've already been told that OSHA is also going to limit the risk to their inspectors, and what they can resolve over the phone and through email, they will. So if you have a written plan in place, you've told your employees to get vaccinated, you've taken other precautions, that might be one way to reduce that risk of saying that they got it in the workplace. So that is, that's a consideration along with all the other things we talked about. So it boils down to, it is a tough decision for an employer to make. There are a lot of articles out there that list more pros and cons. When I talk about do's and don'ts, I didn't say it specifically, but having a process in place. So do have a process in place to vet when somebody wants an exception. Do not chastise them, demean them, talk disrespectfully to them, use stereotypes when you're hearing their complaints. That would be a huge don't. Don't roll your eyes. I mean, these are basic things that I think most of us know, but don't roll your eyes and say, of course you don't want to take the vaccination. You're going to want to just be objective and professional in all your communications with your employees, because statements like that, actions like that can be used against you. So a do would be just have a process in place, follow it consistently, and just make sure that your frontline supervisors and your staff knows that, maybe they should involve HR instead of reacting in that moment and saying something they can't take back, because that would create risk for you as an employer.
Thanks, Michelle. So several questions have come in. Can an employer let an employee go for coming to work with symptoms or having a spouse test positive and that employee not disclosing it to the organization?
That's a great question. Yes, they can, but we have to be a little bit careful here. So the first thing that you would want to clarify is, did I as an employer make it perfectly clear to my employees what I expect? And so that comes down to, an infectious control policy and how you manage your staff. So if that's your rule, then you can absolutely hold them accountable. And normally you would like to use some sort of progressive discipline so that an employee is not caught off by a surprise termination. But in a situation where employees know what's expected of them and they realize the importance of not spreading this in the workplace, and of course, as an employer, you're taking all these precautions and you've been very transparent about what you expect, and they just come in, then that's really insubordination and refusal to follow your policy, just like any other policy. So that should be treated as a disciplinary measure where you're consistent in holding that employee accountable. But yes, I think if somebody's obviously sick, they come in, they're concealing from you that they were positive, that jeopardizes your facility and the rest of your team. And so I think that is absolutely a case where you can skip progressive discipline steps and terminate or, provide a final warning or something. But yes, you can terminate, but there are some things I would like to see in place instead of just immediately terminating.
Thanks, Michelle. And the next question, I believe, goes back to the FFCRA. If I have the question incorrect, please let me know. But if a company with under 50 employees, are they still exempt?
Okay. So when the FFCRA was mandated, no one was exempt if you had less than 50 employees. There's two portions: emergency paid sick leave and expanded FMLA. If it presented a hardship for you to give somebody up to 12 weeks off under the expanded FMLA for childcare reasons, then you could be exempt from following that portion. Now, since we are in the time frame where it is optional, it doesn't matter if you have less than 50 employees or more than 50 employees. You don't have to follow the FFCRA. So I think a lot of people, because they called it expanded FMLA, and FMLA, when we hear that, we are kind of trained to think, oh, I have less than 50 employees, I don't have to worry about that. I think that confused some people because the FFCRA expanded on that type of leave and some of those rules followed. So they were linking it to the FMLA, but only for childcare. Traditional FMLA still applied if somebody developed a serious health condition, if it was COVID related. But everybody is exempt right now from following the FFCRA. It is completely your choice at this point to continue it through March 31st. And if you want to continue just the emergency paid sick leave portion, there's nothing that I've read that said you can't do that. So, especially if, I know a lot of businesses are struggling right now. I know when somebody's out, especially in a small business, puts a burden on the other people that are still there. So that's a legitimate business reason why you would choose not to extend the expanded FMLA portion. So I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Michelle. And feel free to continue sending your questions in the chat box, or when Michelle's finished with the section, I welcome you to ask the question yourself if you feel comfortable. So moving on, Michelle, can you talk through some of the deadlines employers should be planning for now?
Sure. And, several things have been extended or put off. So it seems like March seems to be the hot month for a lot of these things. But just in general, I'm sure everybody knows you have to deliver your W-2s by January 31st. And what somebody may not know is that a W-2 is necessary if an employee has earned $600 or more by your organization. So if you have a hardship as an employer because you're short-staffed or something else, you can apply for an extension on filing that. Just while we're talking about W-2s, a question that comes up a lot is, do I have to do a new W-4 annually for my employees? And the answer is no. If an employee does not want to change their withholding on their taxes, they do not need to complete a new W-4 just because it's a new year. And they can also do a W-4 during the year at any time that they want to change their withholding. So we've already talked a little bit about OSHA. And there are a few things in OSHA we need to be aware of. One, most employers fall under OSHA, need to keep an OSHA log. The summary needs to be posted February 1st through the end of April annually. So it's just the summary. It's not everybody's name and what happened and how many days they were out. It's just the summary of the accidents. And it should be posted anywhere you have all the rest of your employment posters. The other thing under OSHA that comes up at this time is that certain employers are required to report their illnesses and injuries to OSHA, and that is due by March 2nd of 2021. Now, who's most employers? Well, if you have 250 employees or more, then you have to do that, and it would be electronic reporting. If you have 20 up to 249 and you're in certain industries that they deem higher risk for injuries and illnesses, then you have to report. And you might ask, well, do I have to report? Well, it's going to go based on your NACIS code. So you can speak to your work comp provider if you don't know what that is. And Elizabeth, I could send out a link after the call that'll go to the OSHA, I'm combining my words, the OSHA injury reporting website, and it'll tell you what those high-risk industries are. And it'll have just the details about how to do the electronic reporting. Also, EEO-1s. Now, EEO-1s is a federal mandate put out by the EEOC to gather data by job for race and gender. That is due, that we got an extension last year, that is due for 2019 and 2020 this March. So again, something else that's due in March. Now, it is a requirement, it is a mandate, and you should have that data. If you need guidance on how to file, who needs to file, I can send that to you. But basically, if you have 50 or more employees and federal contracts, then you need to gather that data on your employees. You ask them to self-report on a form. You know, what race are you considered, and then you have that in your system to report it by job to the EEOC. Also, if you have 100 or more employees, then you have to follow it regardless of your federal contracts. So you should be collecting that data if you fall into either one of those categories and then reporting it. Now, you're doing it online, and the online portal opens. We don't know when it's going to be open yet, but we do know the deadline is in March of 2021. Now, what you're doing is you're picking a payroll cycle in the fourth quarter of that year. So for employers to go back to 2019, that might be a time-consuming thing to do. 2020 should be pretty easy, but you should have that race and gender and job class for all the employees that were working for you during that one payroll period, and you can pick that period. The other thing is ACA. So ACA, the individual mandate has changed, but the employer mandate is still going strong. And employers have two deadlines related to ACA. They have a deadline to distribute to employees either a 1095-C or a 1095-B, and that has been extended Instead of it being due January 31st, it is now due March 2nd. So that's something else due March 2nd. So I'll go into detail on that in a minute, but if everything's due in March, I wouldn't leave everything till March. I would do what you can now and try to plan ahead, because I don't know what it is about the government, but they're like in March this year. But anyway, so that is just the deadline to distribute to employees. Your deadline to report to the IRS has not been extended. Okay, so your deadline to file for the IRS is March 31st of 2021 if you file electronically. Okay, that is giving the IRS your ACA, you know, what you've contributed for an employer-sponsored health plan by employee. That reporting is due by March 31st of 2021 if you do electronic reporting. Now, if it's your choice, unless you have 250 employees. Once you have 250 employees, you are required to report electronically. If you are reporting manually and sending it in, then the deadline for those paper ones is April 28th of this year. Now, if you've had a hardship, if your business has been hit hard, you can request an extension from the IRS. You can request an extension for the W-2s. You can request an extension for pretty much everything, the EEO-1s and for the ACA. And different extensions have, you know, with the government, have different forms that you're required to send. So it's pretty easy to find out. You can just go to the IRS website, Google how to file an extension for ACA reporting, and it'll tell you what form to do.
So we have lots of questions coming in. This is great. I always get excited when lots of questions start flooding through. So Michelle, can you, in your follow-up, send me some of those dates just so people can reference those again in the follow-up email?
Sure.
So a question that has come in is, so I know you mentioned that hospital was doing some incentives in regards to the vaccine. In regards to offering bonuses to those employees that choose to do that. What other incentives have you seen or heard businesses offering?
Additional time off, personal days. I've heard about monetary and personal days off. It could be gift cards. It could really be anything. The idea is decide as a company what you want. And if your goal is to get everybody to voluntarily choose to be vaccinated, then decide, you know, looking at your workforce, what is it that they would really appreciate? What is it that would motivate them to take that step and get that vaccination? So in some cases, it's money because people are living paycheck to paycheck. In some cases, you've got, you know, a lot of parents and time off would be more important to them. So the idea is just, you know, what would be a benefit to your workforce? And so there's no right or wrong incentive. It's just what you want to do. Now, I want to mention FLSA just real quick because it came to mind. When you have an hourly person and under FLSA, we call that non-exempt. So that means they're not exempt from getting overtime when they work over 40. Overtime is calculated not on minimum wage and not on their hourly rate. It's calculated based on what we call their regular rate. A regular rate takes into consideration differentials for working night shift or weekends. It takes into account their hourly rate and also bonuses. So if a bonus is not discretionary, you know, if I decide on a whim because it's a Wednesday to give all my employees a bonus, that's discretionary. It's at my discretion. A non-discretionary bonus would mean when it's contingent upon something I'm asking or telling you to do. So if I'm asking you to get a vaccination and I give you a bonus because you did it, then that is something that needs to be taken into account for overtime calculations and goes into the regular rate. But I just want to throw that out there because some people don't realize that.
Okay, the next question, Michelle, if a exposure takes place in the workplace, the quarantine is only required for those that have been technically exposed. Is that correct? So if they're required to continue to work and monitor their symptoms, is it acceptable to ask them to continue to work? Those that have been potentially exposed.
Okay, so that's a tough question. So what the CDC has put out is guidance, and it has changed many times since we've dealt with this in March, because we're all learning as we go. So if you had an exposure, one of the things you're going to do is look at who was in close contact. Originally, close contact was defined by the CDC as 15 minutes, an exposure of 15 minutes within a 6 foot of somebody. So think about somebody on a conveyor belt line or working side by side in a cubicle, something like that. So the other thing that has changed with that is the CDC now has said that it's a cumulative 15 minutes. So if I was 5 minutes with you at this point and 5 minutes with you at this point and 5 minutes with you at this point, then that would be deemed a close exposure. So what we need to really do is identify who they were exposed to and tell everybody to monitor for symptoms and seek advice from your medical professional. Now, if that means if they work or not, that is a tough question. You know, you have to say, okay, well, what is my risk? Is it easy for me to let people work remotely? If so, and they're not experiencing symptoms, but they've been exposed, I would have everybody go home, monitor for symptoms, seek advice from their medical professional, and do what they say. But if they could work remotely, I would have them do that. Because it's a safer bet. But once you've been exposed to somebody, we've had a lot of family members come down with COVID and such. Monitoring for symptoms should mean that they don't come to work. But the CDC has put out some options for reducing the quarantine sooner. So originally it was 14 days. Then it was, and one option is 10 days without taking a test, and even another option is 7 days with a negative test. So what that means is if somebody was exposed, let's say a family member that you live with tested positive for COVID, then I would not let that person come to work, even if they were asymptomatic, without a release from a medical professional, testing negative and being quarantined for maybe at least 7 days. But that doesn't mean you may not evaluate whether or not they could work remotely. I hope that answers the question.
Thanks, Michelle. Okay, moving on to the next topic, FMLA. Trust that your supervisors know what their responsibility is.
Okay, the reason that this was a topic I wanted to include is because there is a lot of overlap with COVID-related illnesses. So true, FMLA applies only to employers that have 50 or more employees. But what I want to get out there is a lot of people have experienced layoffs this year. Well, I want to make sure that we know when we are an FMLA employer and when that switch flips on or off. So you have to have 50 or more employees on your payroll for 20 or more non-consecutive calendar work weeks in the current or the preceding year to be deemed an FMLA employer. So if you had 50 in 2021, but now you've had a layoff, and right now in 2020, you only have 30, that doesn't mean you're no longer an FMLA employer this year. You are still an FMLA employer this year. And when somebody has complications related to COVID, we need to dig down into what those complications are to determine whether or not it meets the definition of a serious health condition. A serious health condition is any period of incapacity of 3 days or more, overnight stay in a hospital, ongoing treatment by a medical professional. So you can see how that would apply to COVID. It would apply to workman's comp related injuries. It applies to a lot of things that employers don't necessarily realize. So think about the employee that has never fully recovered from a COVID exposure. An employee is out sick. They're not going to think to say, can you be sure and send me that FMLA paperwork? As an employer, it is your responsibility to know what laws on a federal and state level you are obligated to comply with, and to know when those laws are triggered. So if you've been talking to an employee and you know they can't come to work because they've now been on a ventilator, and you know that they've been with your company a year and they worked 1,250 hours in the preceding 12 months, then that right there tells you that FMLA applies to their situation. So the criteria I went through is on Form 381, put out by the Department of Labor. So we do recommend you use the Department of Labor FMLA forms and go through vetting whether or not a FMLA applies to a person's situation, as opposed to somebody having to request, I need FMLA, especially your frontline supervisors. If an employee has been out sick and tells them, I can't come in for this reason, or I can't come in because my mother is on a ventilator and I've got to care for her, those are FMLA red flags. That should trigger your supervisor to go to HR and let HR know what's going on with that particular employee. But many times the frontline supervisors are tasked with so much, getting the work done, supervising the day-to-day for safety and everything else. They've got a lot on their plate. They shouldn't really be expected to know everything that also falls under an HR umbrella and every law that the employee falls under. But they need to know enough and be trained enough on the HR side to know when to escalate a situation to somebody else, when to bring something to HR to let them know. And I hear that all the time. And then what happens is you don't know, as the employer, maybe you could have interfered with somebody's FMLA rights. That's something you could be sued for. Maybe you terminate somebody for attendance because HR was never told the reason why. Those are big areas of risk for your company and exposure. So there is no magic word that an employee needs to say to trigger their legal protections, whether it's FMLA or ADA or for any other law under FLSA, what we talked about a minute ago regarding pay. They don't need to use those special acronyms or jargon to let you know that that law applies to their situation. So HR needs to work on being knowledgeable, number one, themselves, and then training the supervisors when they need to bring something to them.
Thank you, Michelle.
Sure.
Okay, and our final topic that we're going to visit about today is what determines if a benefit deduction is taxable or not?
Okay, so I got this question like 3 times in the past couple weeks, and I was surprised. A lot of companies, especially smaller employers, are processing their own payroll. And they're asking me, can this benefit be pre-tax? Well, I mean, it can be, but in order for it to legally be a pre-tax benefit, it needs to fall under what's known as Section 125 under the IRS. And many benefits can be pre-tax, which is, of course, an added plus for both the employer and the employee, because an employee is having to pay taxes on a lesser amount of income because benefits are taken out pre-tax. So let's say they earn $35,000 a year, but if their benefits are taken out pre-tax, they only earn $30,000. So instead of paying taxes on 35, they get the added value of paying taxes on 30 grand. So the employer has same benefit, they get to pay taxes on a lesser amount. So it's a way to incentivize participation in benefits. So it's has many benefits to both parties, but it's not something that can be done arbitrarily. There needs to be paperwork that details out of the plan. So Section 125 under the IRS, there's a plan for that. There's also a cafeteria plan, which says that all of the benefits that I have are offered like a cafeteria offering to my employees, and they get to pick and choose, and those benefits meet the criteria to be able to be pre-tax. So if you aren't sure whether or not you have a cafeteria plan or the paperwork in order, you should check with your benefits broker. You should check with your tax professional. These sorts of things fall under ERISA, which is very specific and detailed legal compliance requirement for employers. We can talk about it to a degree, but we are not ERISA experts. So we can explain what your options are and give you some links that talk about the details. But it is something that you should have in place and you should know. And, you know, benefits brokers are used to this. So they should know how to get you, whether a POP plan is needed to cover it, or they should know how to point you in the right direction to get those plans for you.
Thank you, Michelle. So I haven't received any other questions. I'll give you a few more minutes if you want to send a question in the chat box. A few reminders. The next Clear Up the Chaos is taking place Tuesday, February 9th. So please mark your calendars. If you're already interested in attending or receiving the video and follow-up information, please just go to our website and sign up, and I'll get notification and I will send over that information for our next call. Please feel free to email myself if you have any questions between now and the next Clear Up the Chaos. If any topics come up that you're interested in Michelle covering, we would love to have input from y'all. As always, I'm a resource for you to reach out to and help you at any point in time, and Michelle is as well. So between the two of us, we usually can point you in the right direction. But with no further questions, thank you for your time today, and I will send the recording if you want to share it with anyone within your organization, and I will also share that follow-up information that she mentioned. Thanks so much and have a great week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Please give us those topics. Thank you.
Bye.